In very layman terms, it brings microservices architecture from back end to front end.
I thought today we'll discuss micro front ends, and theoretically it makes sense to me, but practically I'm not sure how it works. So before getting into that discussion, can you elaborate on micro front ends for people who do not even understand what the term means?
Sure. So micro front end is an architecture or a design approach you where the free front end is decomposed into individual and independent or loosely together applications. The idea for this is, um, if I have an application or a product that I'm building, right? Now, if the split is front end and back end, and within front end there are multiple teams, it's very difficult to make that coordinate. It's very difficult to coordinate over a project. The release timelines gets a little sketchy. How a particular feature gets deployed becomes difficult. Let's say there is one feature which is in the pipeline which is not ready for a deployment, and you have another feature that needs an immediate deployment. How do you schedule things for that? How do you keep on rolling releases as you go? So micro frontend is a paradigm or a technique or a architecture pattern to solve this kind of an issue. In very layman terms, it brings microservices architecture from back end to front end.
Do you see multiple frameworks being a part of micro front ends, or in your scenario is just one component, one framework, and then just dividing the architecture into front ends?
Um, while this is absolutely possible, and but again, I would not recommend that. The idea being, obviously there is a cost to everything, right? And if you have different frameworks, they will have their own loading time, and there's a cost of latency that you'll pay. Is it worth the effort? Is it something that you want to actively spend your resources on? Rather, if you want to have a standardized architecture, there is a lot of pieces of code that you can reuse in your organization. For example, even in a dashboard, you would still like to have a common theme, right? Now, if for let's say your one architecture is based on X framework, the other is based on Y framework, and they are not compatible. So then you're probably reinventing the wheel. You are, and for a very simple example, let's say there's a button component. At one place it's in React, and the other place it's just jQuery, right? Then you have to ensure that they have a common CSS, their functionalities is the same. You'll write unit tests twice and things like that. I don't see that as a good use of time.
That's what threw me off when I read the definition of micro frontends, because at least the first few articles that I read, people were propelling for multiple frameworks being used. So that's
But okay, let me put it this way. Um, Front end language being the same, or framework being the same, right? And let's just talk in terms of the data source. Let's say there is one piece of code or one widget that needs to be reactive,
Mhm.
right? For or let's say is one piece of backend which needs to do a lot of parallel processing, whereas other is a very rudimentary and latency is not of high concern. So you can use very two different languages to build those APIs independently and not wait if things will go wrong or not. You can run an A/B experiment only on one widget, right? And that will not interfere with any other part of the application.
Mhm.
Traditionally, when you run A/B experiments, the idea is you're testing only and only one thing, and that's how it works, because that's how you're able to find if the metrics are pointing to the right direction or not. Uh, but yeah, I see a lot of benefits with micro frontends.
So I'm a little confused. How does that differentiate? How is that different from just either a component based architecture wherein you have different components, or just if you even want separate deployables, you can just use mono-repos, right?
You're talking about the front end or the back end?
Front end.
You can have, okay. When you say mono repo, what do you mean?
I mean, if you wanted to abstract different pages out as some repositories to maintain them separately, you probably, it's an overkill, but you still can do that. Or you can just have the basics of component based architecture is you have different components for different pages, right?
Sure. Okay. Working in both monorepo and n-repo architecture, right? Both have both of these architectures and philosophies have their pros and cons, to be honest. I'll not say that one is right over the other.
Mhm.
I have seen use cases for the both of them, and I've worked with both of them on production.
Mhm.
And I'm talking about a highly scalable product or a highly scalable company in this case. So there is a definite use case, and I'm sure there are things that you can achieve with monorepo.
Mhm.
But after a point of time, one conflict that I felt was defining the ownership. So what you do is you basically say this feature is being owned by a particular team. Let's say feature A is owned by team A, feature
Mhm.
B is owned by team B, and feature C is a cross-cutting team, which is a common team, which will build the common components, right?
Okay.
Which is owned by team C. There are still grounds where things go slippery. What if there is a new architecture or a new paradigm uh, team A wants to bring into their platform, right?
Mhm.
Now what they'll have to do is any piece of JS that they will write will bloat the entire JS build.
Mhm.
The other way to do is using suspense or basically doing a sharding of JS files, right? But again, to an extent, if I take a step back, that is something that I'm trying to achieve. Even with a monorepo, the idea is to make independent teams
Mhm.
and do independent deployment. If I am striving for that, what should stop me from creating a micro frontend? So, so I'm not arguing that you need this. I'm saying I do see a use case for this.
So is micro front end just organizational team structure around front ends, and then the tools can vary, or how do you define it?
I'll definitely not define it that way. I don't know how I define it, but that's not how I'll define it for sure. I will not push myself at the edge where people can just throw me off, right? And if I agree to that statement, it would be probably just doing that. I can say that micro frontend, the approach is to give autonomy back to the teams. That's one of the takeaways for sure. So there, so teams can have complete control on their features and roadmaps without having to align specific so a mega I think it basically ensures that you don't have a mega change or a cross-cutting change, and your impact of change is limited to your product.
Okay, and how do you see it in terms of execution? Do you see every team having their own repository or mono repo, or it again varies according to you?
I think we are still in the early ages of micro frontend. So
Mhm.
uh, I can talk about what I think should be done.
Yeah, definitely everyone has their opinions.
Yeah, so I would probably prefer each team having their own repositories, own packages,
Okay.
having their own CI/CD or having their own pipelines and deployment strategies,
Mhm.
which is not interfering with anyone else. They are just accessing the global state or the global um, objects or references through props so that they are reactive. For example, what I can do is at one point of time I can have a Redux or any other state coming in, and I can then build a stream out of that,
Mhm.
and then my one architecture can be completely reactive, whereas other architecture can be something which is entirely different, using or following entirely different paradigms.
So one repo which is just a skeleton of the application, and then multiple repositories for each of the
Yeah,
different parts of the application.
yeah, something like that.
Okay. And what are the, I guess let's discuss both the benefits and the disadvantages of that compared to monorepos.
Advantages, I see that each team will, okay, in a monorepo, the fundamental problem is there is one pipeline to deploy the entire change.
Okay.
Right? Um, with micro frontends, you'll have different pipelines.
Mhm.
This is one thing that I think is a major win.
Mhm.
Um, in case of fire, right? When one team says, I don't want to deploy because things are broken, and the other team says, I want to deploy because things are broken. Which what path will you take? The immediate path is to take a rollback, right? Because previous state was the right state. But you get to these weird scenarios. With micro frontend, that is less likely to occur. Um, Testability becomes a little more eased out.
Mhm.
Um, Apart from that, the choices of technology, architecture, and paradigms. I've specifically not chosen the word framework, but that becomes independent.
Mhm.
Every team is responsible for their own. The downsides would probably be, I think, payload sizes is one downside that I can think of. Uh, if people definitely if people are using different frameworks, right?
Mhm.
If not, again things can be sharded and
Mhm.
it can be done independently. Um, the another con that I see is having that base setup will require hit and trial,
Mhm.
especially with a team which is not um, very well catered to micro front end. They might have some ramp up time needed. There might be some operational complexity which will be involved in running this. Uh, but I do see benefit. I do see simple and decoupled code bases as a good pro in this case, where each team is managing their own. So there are autonomous teams who have the autonomy to decide their roadmap and deploy.
It also will bring in some additional communication overhead if something needs to be changed in the main skeleton of the application.
So not really. Again, think of it this way: I have a global state, and I'm talking about a pattern, something I reselect, right? You
Mhm.
have a selector, you are selecting something. Um, in functional programming, there's a concept called lenses. Lenses is basically data. It is a function. I think that's the easiest to say. Lenses is basically a function which gives you two properties, get and set. In a very high level term, what you do is, let's say you have a mega object which is
Mhm.
like has plenty of data. You don't need the entire object again, right? And Redux, because it generates a new object every time, you have a new metadata on every step. So what does is lenses gives you a mechanism to view only a certain a part of the tree,
Okay.
and you can only update that and get a new object very quickly. right?
Okay.
So just think of it as a magnifying lens, right?
Yeah.
You have a giant object, you're just focusing on certain parts. And that is something very analogous to what reselect does, right? You have a reselect, you write a selector that says, okay, I want to select this particular property from the state and then update that, right? Which is very similar to um, both these concepts.
I haven't
So
used reselect, but I get the concept now.
okay, so now this would be very similar to that.
Mhm.
I have a mega state tree. I have a mega state tree, and all each widget has to do is only be responsible for their information. There might be some information which is obviously being used by all the other teams, like user and things like that, which would probably be, in most cases, be a read only, or
Mhm.
even if it's a write only, it shouldn't be much of a big deal, because any which ways, your state is your single source of truth.
Yeah. Then probably there's a cross-functional team that is taking care of cross-functional
Yeah,
functionality as well.
yeah.
Okay.
So obviously, you'll need one team which is cross-cutting.
Mhm.
For example, every product has a different UI UX.
Yeah.
So sometime uh, by hook or by crook, you always need one team which is ensuring that the global UI UX is the same, right?
Mhm.
There is one common team across the product. Some companies call it the platform team, some call it the common UI team, and things like that. So you will definitely need that here as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. The definitely the next question that I have is, it makes sense for probably an enterprise who has a crazy amount of teams working on different parts of the product. But does it make sense for a medium-sized organization, or what would be a good team size to start incorporating it? Or do you think it's also applicable to smaller team sizes as well?
Okay, this is relatively new, and every company, every product has its own requirements, right? But if I were to do an architecture today, I would probably do it in a micro front-end fashion. Um, one, um, irrespective of the team size and number of people working on that on a particular product, uh, irrespective of that, I'll start with a micro front-end architecture. The idea being, I can break down parts of the page into multiple sections, and each one of can be deployed and developed. Oh, sorry, each of these components can be developed and deployed separately. I don't have to wait for a particular day or a particular release strategy to follow. These tools and technology can have their own underlying architecture. Just to give you a bird's eye view, micro front end is basically one. There is one front end and one backend application tying it to the front end, right? That means every component has a different is making a separate ajax or an API call to the backend, and then those are getting clubbed together. So different parts of the application can have different data sources, which is coming from different database or XYZ data source. So in a big company, I agree, it definitely makes a lot of sense. For me, it makes a lot of sense even for smaller companies, because they have to move faster.
Mhm.
Smaller companies um, probably don't probably would fail very fast, would try to ship as soon as possible, um, and get to production very quickly. And as a company is growing, they would want to identify leaders and points of contact for in their organization, and want to assign pieces so that they are able to accelerate individual domains. And that is something where it fits phenomenally. Additionally, if for a companies which have a dashboard kind of an architecture, there is something that I see that this is I think that's one example that I use to visualize myself. You can assign parts a real state of a page to multiple teams, and they are developing independently. They have their own sprints or Kanban boards, they have their own deployment strategies, and nobody is impacted by that. You have obviously a mega the wrapper component which basically holds everything, but apart from that, things are very independent. I think this covers a brief overview of what micro frontend is. As a reference, I would definitely recommend going through Martin Fowler's blog or article on micro frontends. Additionally, if people have time, they should try doing a POC. It's a very fun side little project, but should give you a good understanding on how to proceed from there.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I'll probably try and do that. And if I end up being successful, I'll probably put a GitHub link in the description. If you don't find one, I was not successful.
Sounds good. Or after that, I'll be waiting to read about it on your blog.
I'll definitely, if I'm successful, I'll definitely make a post. And Martin Fowler is one resource I think everyone should just refer whenever they want to. He just writes so much content around so many industry practices. So I definitely think Uncle Bob and Martin Fowler are just legends that everyone should be referring to.
Definitely. And this is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching the video and hope it was helpful. And I'm hoping that you'll subscribe to wherever you are watching this and also join our Discord server for such discussions. You also get to give us feedback about things that we should cover in the future, or just tell us what we should be covering more of, because there's so many topics and we still are not sure which ones to cover, which ones not to. Thank you.